this episode, we're going to slow down in a way that actually makes you faster, because the quickest exam thinkers are usually the ones with the clearest definitions. A lot of privacy content sounds simple until you realize that tiny differences between words can change what an organization is allowed to do, what it must do, and what it should do as a matter of good program design. The Certified Information Privacy Manager, CIPM, exam loves those differences, not to be annoying, but because privacy management is basically a discipline of careful meaning. When you can define terms plainly, you read questions with less guesswork, you spot what is being tested more quickly, and you make decisions that are consistent with a well-run program. Our goal is a spoken glossary, meaning you should be able to hear each term and immediately translate it into a practical idea you can use. We'll focus on high-yield terms that show up again and again in privacy program discussions, and we'll keep the definitions simple, accurate, and connected to real decisions. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good starting point is the word privacy itself, because people use it like it means one thing, when it really points to a set of goals and expectations. In a program sense, privacy is about managing how information about people is collected, used, shared, stored, and eventually disposed of, in ways that respect rights, reduce harm, and meet obligations. Notice that privacy is not the same as secrecy, because privacy is not about hiding everything. It is about appropriate use and appropriate control. Privacy is also not identical to security, because security is about protecting data from unauthorized access and damage, while privacy focuses on the legitimacy and fairness of processing, even when security is strong. When you hear privacy program, think of an organized effort to keep data use aligned with rules and expectations over time, not a one-time compliance event. If you can keep this big definition steady, a lot of smaller terms will fall into place naturally, because they are all describing parts of the same system. Next, you need to be comfortable with the idea of personal data and personal information, because the entire privacy program turns on what data is in scope. Personal data is information that relates to an identified or identifiable person, and the key word is identifiable. Identifiable means you can reasonably figure out who the person is, either directly through a name or ID, or indirectly through combinations of information that narrow down identity. Personally identifiable information, PII, is a common label for this idea, and you should treat it as a practical category of data that can point to a person, especially when combined with other data. Beginners sometimes get stuck trying to decide if a single data element is always PII, but a better program mindset is to consider context, combinations, and likelihood of identification. Another important distinction is sensitive data, which is not always defined the same way everywhere, but generally signals higher harm potential if misused or exposed. High harm potential should trigger stronger controls, tighter access, and more careful decisions about collection and retention. Now let's define processing, because privacy management is mostly about managing processing rather than managing data as a static object. Processing is basically anything you do with personal data, such as collecting it, storing it, using it, sharing it, analyzing it, or deleting it. That wide definition matters because privacy obligations often apply to the entire life cycle, not just the moment data is collected. When you hear the phrase processing activity, picture a chain of steps from where data comes from to where it goes, including who touches it and what systems or partners are involved. This is also why data flow understanding matters so much, because you cannot manage privacy if you do not understand how data moves. A common misconception is that privacy only matters when data leaves the organization, but internal use can create major privacy risks too, especially when data is repurposed or combined. If you can define processing as end-to-end handling, you will be more accurate when questions ask about responsibilities and controls, because you will naturally consider more than one step. You also need clean definitions for the main roles in many privacy frameworks, because exam questions often test accountability and ownership. A controller is the party that decides why and how personal data is processed, meaning it sets the purpose and key means of processing. A processor is the party that processes personal data on behalf of the controller, meaning it follows the controller's instructions within an agreed scope. The simplest way to remember this is that controllers decide and processors do, though real life can be more complex when organizations share decisions. These role labels matter because obligations, contracts, and oversight expectations can differ depending on the role. If you hear vendor, service provider, or third party, your brain should automatically ask whether that party is acting as a processor, a controller, or something mixed, because that affects governance and operational steps. Another key role term is data subject, which is simply the person the data is about, because privacy programs are ultimately managing impacts on real people. When you keep these roles straight, you are less likely to choose answers that assign responsibilities to the wrong party. Purpose is another high-yield term, because privacy programs often fail when purpose becomes vague or shifts without control. Purpose is the reason personal data is collected and used, and a strong purpose statement is specific enough that people can tell what is inside the boundary and what is outside. Purpose limitation is the principle that data should be used for the stated purposes and not quietly expanded into new uses that people did not expect or agree to. This is where program discipline matters, because businesses naturally want flexibility, and privacy programs create a controlled way to gain flexibility without breaking trust. Data minimization is closely connected, and it means collecting and using only what is reasonably needed for the purpose, not everything that might be useful someday. Minimization is not anti-business. It is a risk reduction strategy, because less data means fewer breach impacts, fewer rights handling burdens, and fewer surprises. When a question asks what a privacy program should do early in a project, a strong answer often involves clarifying purpose and minimizing data, because those decisions shape everything downstream. If you train yourself to listen for purpose clarity, you will spot the best answer options more quickly. Legal basis or lawful basis is a term that can intimidate beginners, but the plain idea is simple. It is the justification for processing personal data under applicable rules. Different frameworks list different lawful bases, but common examples include consent, contract necessity, legal obligation, vital interests, public task, and legitimate interests. For exam purposes, you do not need to recite every possible category perfectly, but you do need to recognize that processing should have a defensible reason that aligns with obligations and expectations. Consent is a big one, and the key is that meaningful consent should be informed, specific, and freely given, not buried or coerced. Legitimate interests is another important term, and it generally means an organization has a valid business interest, but it must consider and balance that interest against the risks and impacts to individuals. If you hear balancing, think of a reasoned evaluation, not a casual guess, because the program must be able to defend the decision and adjust it if impacts change. When you understand lawful basis as a structured justification, you are less likely to choose answers that treat data use as automatically allowed just because the organization wants it. Transparency is a term that sounds obvious until you realize it has operational requirements, not just good intentions. Transparency means people should be able to understand what data is being collected, why, how it will be used, who it may be shared with, how long it will be kept, and what rights they have. Notice and privacy notice are practical tools of transparency because they are how you communicate those facts in a usable way. A common misconception is that a notice is only a legal document for protection, but a strong privacy program treats notice as part of trust building and part of setting expectations that guide behavior. If a notice says one thing and operations do another, you have a program integrity problem that shows up in risk, complaints, and enforcement actions. Choice is another transparency-adjacent term, because some contexts require giving people options about certain processing, and those options must be honored in actual systems and workflows. A privacy program manager should hear transparency and immediately think of alignment between what is said, what is done, and what can be proven. That alignment is what makes transparency real rather than performative. Rights are high-yield terms because they translate directly into operational processes, and exam questions often revolve around how rights are handled. Common rights concepts include access, correction, deletion, portability, restriction, and objection, though the exact set depends on the framework. The important part is that a program must be able to receive, verify, and respond to requests consistently and within required timelines. Data Subject Access Request, DSAR, is a common label for rights requests, and you should hear it and think intake process, identity verification, scope assessment, coordination with data owners, and documented response. Verification matters because you must avoid disclosing personal data to the wrong person while still making the process usable for legitimate requesters. Another key term is authentication, which is how you confirm someone's identity, though you should think of it as a principle rather than a specific technology in this context. A mature program also tracks requests and outcomes, because rights handling is a measurable program function, not an ad hoc scramble. When rights terms appear in exam questions, they often test process design and accountability more than law memorization. Data inventory and records of processing are terms that can sound like paperwork, but they are foundational to operating privacy at scale. A data inventory is a structured understanding of what personal data you have, where it is, where it comes from, who uses it, and where it goes. Without that, you cannot answer rights requests well, you cannot assess risk well, and you cannot respond to incidents well, because you are operating in the dark. Records of Processing Activities, or OPA, is a term often used for formal documentation of processing, and your plain language definition should be that it is a catalog of what processing happens and the core details that make it governable. These records help you see patterns, such as repeated data sharing with partners or unexpected uses that no longer match original purposes. They also support accountability, because you can assign owners to processing activities and require reviews when changes occur. Beginners sometimes hope to skip inventory work because it feels tedious, but the exam and real program life treat it as a core capability. If you can explain why inventories exist and how they support decision-making, you will be stronger on scenario questions that involve unknown data flows or incomplete visibility. Risk is another term that needs to be plain and stable in your mind, because privacy program management is essentially applied risk management. Risk in this context is the possibility of harm or negative impact resulting from the processing of personal data, and that harm can affect individuals, the organization, or both. Impact refers to how bad the outcome could be, while likelihood refers to how probable it is, and good risk thinking considers both rather than focusing on fear. Privacy risk is not only about breaches, because harm can also come from inappropriate use, unfair decisions, excessive retention, or loss of trust due to surprise processing. A privacy risk assessment is a structured way to identify risks, evaluate them, and choose mitigations, and it should produce outputs that lead to action rather than just a report. Privacy Impact Assessment, PIA, and Data Protection Impact Assessment, DPIA, are common assessment labels, and the practical meaning is that you analyze processing, identify risks, and document how the organization will reduce those risks. The exam often tests whether you recognize when an assessment is appropriate, especially when processing is new, high impact, or involves sensitive data. If you can translate risk terms into a repeatable evaluation process, you will choose more program-shaped answers. Mitigation and controls are terms that go together because identifying risk without changing anything is not privacy management, it is just worry. A mitigation is a step that reduces risk by lowering likelihood, lowering impact, or both. And in programs, mitigations should be realistic and trackable. Controls are the mechanisms that enforce or support mitigations, and they can be administrative, technical, or physical, though you do not need to dive into implementation details to understand the program purpose. Administrative controls might include policies, training, approvals, and oversight, while technical controls might include access restrictions and monitoring, and physical controls might include secured locations. The important point is that controls should be mapped to risks and reviewed for effectiveness, not chosen randomly. Another key term is residual risk, which is the risk that remains after mitigations are applied, and programs must decide whether residual risk is acceptable or requires further treatment. Acceptable risk is tied to risk appetite, meaning the level of risk the organization is willing to tolerate to achieve goals, and that tolerance should be explicit, not accidental. Exam questions often test whether you understand that privacy decisions involve trade-offs, and that those trade-offs should be governed and documented, not improvised. Retention and deletion terms are deceptively important because they touch both compliance obligations and practical risk reduction. Retention means how long data is kept, and a retention schedule is a structured set of rules that link data categories to time periods and deletion triggers. The plain language idea is that you keep data as long as needed for legitimate purposes and obligations, then you dispose of it safely when it is no longer needed. Disposal is not just deleting a file in a casual sense. It means ensuring data is not accessible or recoverable in a way that defeats the intent of deletion. Minimization and retention work together, because if you collect less data and keep it for less time, you reduce exposure and simplify governance. A common misconception is that retaining everything is safer because you might need it later, but privacy programs treat indefinite retention as a risk multiplier. Retention decisions also affect rights handling, because if you cannot locate data reliably or cannot delete it consistently when required, your program becomes fragile. When exam scenarios mention unclear retention, legacy systems, or inconsistent deletion practices, you should think of lifecycle governance and operational procedures that make retention rules executable. If you can explain retention in plain terms and connect it to risk and trust, you are well positioned for operational questions. Incidents and breaches are terms that create anxiety, so it helps to define them calmly and clearly. An incident is an event that threatens the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of personal data, or the proper functioning of privacy controls, and it can include mistakes, misconfigurations, unauthorized access, or improper disclosure. A breach is often used to describe a confirmed incident where personal data has been accessed, disclosed, or lost in a way that violates obligations or expectations, though definitions can vary by framework. The key program concept is that you need a repeatable way to detect, assess, contain, and learn from these events, because improvisation is where small problems become large ones. Incident response, IR, is the common label for that structured approach, and you should hear it and think coordinated process with roles, timelines, documentation, and follow-up improvements. Notification is another high-yield term, because some incidents trigger obligations to notify authorities or affected individuals, and those decisions often depend on risk evaluation and legal requirements. Even if the exam does not test every notification detail, it will test that you recognize the program must have criteria, decision makers, and communication procedures ready ahead of time. When you define incidents as a process problem, not just a scary event, you move toward the program manager mindset the exam is looking for. Now let's focus on governance terms that show up constantly, because governance is where privacy programs either become durable or collapse into chaos. Governance is the system of decision rights, accountability, oversight, and escalation that keeps privacy consistent across teams. A charter is a foundational document that defines the privacy program's scope, authority, responsibilities, and how it connects to organizational goals. Policies are high-level rules that describe what must be true, such as requirements for data handling or approval processes, while procedures explain how to do the work in a repeatable way. Standards often sit between policy and procedure, providing more specific requirements that teams can implement consistently, though the labels can vary by organization. Accountability means someone owns outcomes, not just tasks, and a mature program makes accountability visible rather than implied. Stakeholders are the people or groups affected by privacy decisions, including legal, security, product, marketing, human resources, and vendors, and alignment means reducing friction by making expectations clear and involving the right parties at the right time. When you hear governance terms, you should think about making privacy repeatable through structure, not just through individual effort. Many exam questions reward the answer that strengthens governance, because stronger governance tends to prevent repeated operational failures. To close out this glossary episode, the main goal is not that you memorize a list of definitions, but that you build a clean, spoken translation layer between exam language and practical meaning. When you hear personal data, or PII, you should immediately think identifiable person and context, and when you hear processing, you should picture the full life cycle of data handling. When you hear controller and processor, you should think decision-making versus acting on instructions, because responsibility follows those roles. When you hear purpose limitation and minimization, you should think clarity and restraint that reduce risk and build trust. When you hear rights and DSAR, you should think repeatable intake and response processes, not a one-off favor. When you hear risk, PIA, or DPIA, you should think structured evaluation that leads to mitigations and measurable controls. When you hear retention, incident, breach, and IR, you should think lifecycle discipline and preparedness rather than panic. If these terms feel stable and plain in your mind, you will read questions faster, reason more clearly, and choose answers that reflect a coherent privacy program, which is exactly what CIPM is trying to measure.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.